Hi and welcome to the show. Over the course of this series, we're going to be traveling the length and breadth of Israel, checking out some of the most fascinating sites in this country. We're also going to be discovering a lot about the Jewish people's 4,000-year history on this land. And not only that, from time to time, we're going to be checking in with Rabbi Wein, one of the foremost historians and experts on Jewish history, and he's going to be giving us some fresh insights into Jewish history and this land, a land like no other. We're going to be kicking off our show in the hub of the country, and according to the Jews, the center of the world. Yeah, Jerusalem. This is the famous Ben Yehuda Street, and this is a place that's filled with exciting stores, exciting restaurants, and some very interesting people. That's perhaps why this is the #2 most sought after destination point, and where we're going today is #1. That's right, the Old City. In many ways, Jerusalem is a city of extremes. It's home to the latest trends and fashions, and it's also the seat of our age-old culture. It's a bustling modern city with every first-world accoutrement, and at the same time, within a few minutes' walk, you could find yourself enwrapped in ancient history. You know, when you look around and you see how developed Israel is, it's hard to believe that the state is only about 55 years old. The existence of the state itself is actually quite miraculous when you think about it. #1, the fact that the Jews have survived through all these years of persecution, that the state of Israel was built up largely by a world Jewry that was still reeling from the Holocaust. And also considering that as soon as the state of Israel was born, it was nearly destroyed. When Israel declared independence in 1948, she was immediately attacked by 5 Arab countries. There was a fierce battle, and we ended up losing part of Jerusalem. This was especially painful for us, because for the first time in centuries, the Jews had been cut off from those places of Jerusalem that are most vital and central to Jewish life, namely the place where the temples once stood and the Western Wall. At the time of Jordanian rule, if any Jew dared step pretty much past this line in an attempt to go pray at the Western Wall, for instance, he would have been shot on sight. And so it was for the first 19 years of Israel's history. To make matters worse, in 1967, the Jordanians and Egyptians attempted to invade Israel in the hopes of wiping her out. Miraculously, the Israeli army managed to push them back in a war that lasted only 6 days. We won the war, and we won control of our beloved Old City. This was probably one of the most emotionally charged periods of Israel's history. Within a matter of weeks, practically every single Israeli has visited the wall. Even the most seasoned secular Israeli wept at the excitement of the moment. So the question is, what kind of history is there here in Jerusalem that can evoke so much emotion in the Jewish people even to this day? And what makes this place so special that it's sought after by every single major world religion? And more than that, did you know that Jerusalem has been conquered time and time and time again by some of the world's mightiest empires? What makes this place so special? Rabbi Wein?
Jerusalem is a special city. It's different than other cities in the world. Most major cities were located either as seaports or on rivers or where commercial roads crossed, and Jerusalem has none of those qualities. Jerusalem was always a spiritual center, a holy city, and that's why it has attracted so many different nations and been ruled by so many different people. Because commerce alone is certainly important, but as the Torah teaches us, you do not live by bread alone. And therefore, a spiritual center is also needed. Jerusalem always was the spiritual center of the world, and therefore many different nations, many different religions tried to conquer it, tried to maintain it, tried to make it its own. but Jerusalem has always remained the eternal capital of the Jewish people in its heart and mind.
So, there you have it. And that's why Jews all over the world, no matter where they are, face Jerusalem when they pray. Because we understand that it was right here where the temple stood and will stand again, which means that this place, this spot on the planet, is the spiritual core of the world. As you know, this is the Western Wall, also known as the Kotel, and this is probably the most famous site in all of Israel. And for good reason. You see, this is one of the few things that is left from the Second Temple that was destroyed by the Romans over 2,000 years ago. Now, despite the fact that Jerusalem has been plundered time and time and time again, the Western Wall has always stood. And what's really interesting is that there's a Jewish midrash that was written over 2,000 years ago that said just that the Western Wall of the temple will never, ever be destroyed. So apart from the intense spirituality that a person can feel when they're standing here at the wall, the Kotel has also become a symbol of hope, resilience, and strength to Jews throughout the ages. And that right there is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That area is known as the third holiest site to Muslims. And in case you're thinking that maybe the temples were built on Muslim holy soil, well, it's interesting to note that the second temple was destroyed about 540 years before the religion of Islam even began. Okay, back to the tour. This is Jaffa Gate, one of the many entrances to the old city, and perhaps a very special symbol of hope. Let me tell you an incredible story. These walls that you see behind here, these aren't the original walls that stood 2,500 years ago. Those were actually destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and his Babylonian army on the 10th day of the Jewish month of Teves, 586 BCE. That's the 10th of Teves, 586. Now, I mentioned that date for a reason. Come look at this. Now, these walls that you see here were built by the Ottoman Emperor Suleiman the Magnificent about 460 years ago. Over the years, these walls fell into disrepair. That is until the Jews came back. When we came back, we started to rebuild and refurbish the walls. And you'll never guess what date the rebuilding was completed. Take a look at what this relief says. It says, Bayom Asara B'Tevet Eichet Shin Lamed, which means the 10th day of Teves, 1970. 2,556 years exactly to the day after these walls were destroyed, they're rebuilt and hugging Jerusalem's old city once again. I guess you could say this is what you call the magic and mystery of Jewish history. I mean, think about it. Over 2,500 years ago, one of the strongest, greatest civilizations, the Babylonians, the empire, the Babylonian Empire, they set out to destroy the Jewish people and the Jewish capital. Well, they killed thousands and thousands of Jews and carted the rest off into slavery. They also did destroy the Jewish capital. Now, anyone living at that time probably would have thought that the mighty Babylonians would have lived forever and ever, and that the little Jews, well, they would have just disappeared into the history books. And we see that that's not the case at all. Practically every empire that has set out to destroy the Jewish people, they're the ones in the history books. And the Jews, we're still here. It's quite incredible.
Just as you enter Jaffa Gate, to the left are two tombs. These are the tombs of the architects hired by Suleiman the Magnificent to plan and construct the walls of Jerusalem. But in the time-honored tradition of Middle Eastern contractors, they shortchanged it. They cut corners. The length of the wall was not quite what was measured, or what it was supposed to be. He didn't mess around with Suleiman. He had a very short temper and he had a very high gallows. And therefore he took the two architects and he hanged them. And then he buried them inside the walls that they had constructed as a reminder to the population of what happens to people that try to shortchange Suleiman the Magnificent.
As you come into the old city, you'll find the historic Tower of David. Now, it's interesting to note that in the Bible, in the Song of Songs, a lover speaks about his lover's neck as being reminiscent of the Tower of David. And in the Talmud, it actually records how King David minted some coins that had a picture of the Tower of David on the obverse. And right here behind me, what you see has actually got nothing to do with the Tower of David at all. I mean, I wish I could say that this is the Tower of David, but it's not. What you see behind me is actually built by King Herod about 2,000 years ago. So the question is, why did they call it the Tower of David? Well, probably because the Crusaders and the different civilizations that conquered this place, they wanted it to be the Tower of David. So they called it the Tower of David. And I guess the name stuck. The Jewish quarter in the Old City houses fortresses thousands of years old, synagogue hundreds of years old, and is probably one of the only archaeological tourist sites in the world that also has a modern middle-class neighborhood smack in the middle of it. The Jews in Jerusalem have a very long history. Mentioned in the canon of Jewish writings over 700 times, Jerusalem has been the focus of Jewish life for close to 4,000 years.
And Jews had by tradition known that this was the holy city, the holy place, the place that the Lord recommended that the Jewish people create a temple there. David himself is unable to build a temple, and his son Solomon, when he succeeds to the throne, becomes the builder of the temple. The city is captured by the Babylonians in about the 5th century before the Common Era. The temple is destroyed. The Jews are taken into exile. 70 years later, they return under the great scribe Ezra, and they begin to rebuild the city. However, that temple was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans, by Titus, and the temple was leveled, and so was most of the city of Jerusalem. The Jews came back to Jerusalem, however, and in 135, Bar Kokhba's rebellion took place with the attempt to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount. When it failed in 139, then the Romans, with their heavy hand, destroyed any hope of Jewish continuity in Jerusalem. They leveled the mountain of Moriah itself, and the only remnant that was left of the temple was the great Western Wall, which was a retaining wall built by Herod on the western side of the courtyard of the temple. This Western Wall became the holiest spot in Judaism simply because of the fact that it was our remnant of what once was the great temple. Over the ages, other nations and other faiths came to control the Temple Mount. In the 7th century, Omar came and built the Golden Mosque, which exists on the Temple Mount until today. The Muslims took it as being a place of worship for them. When the Crusaders came 4 centuries later, they took the mosque and converted it to a church. When the Emperor Saladin drove out the Crusaders and the country reverted back to Muslim rule, it became a mosque again. But the Jews never went away from the Western Wall, even though the Western Wall was subjected to all sorts of indignities. Garbage was piled there. People were stoned there. And the Jewish connection to Jerusalem and to the Temple Mount remained under all circumstances.
In fact, if you look inside millions of Jewish homes, you'll notice a section of a wall that remains unplastered. This is to remind us that unless we've rebuilt Jerusalem to her former glory, our lives aren't quite complete. This kind of gives you a glimpse into how central Jerusalem is to the lives of the Jews. The old city is inhabited by many unique and colorful cultures, and over the century, each of those cultures have settled in different distinct pockets or quarters of the old city. Where we're standing right here is in the center of the old city. It's not the geographical center, but rather the demographic center. And from here, we can actually get an overview and look at the various different quarters. So let's go take a look. This is the Armenian quarter. During World War I, Muslims in Turkey set out on a campaign of slaughter against Armenian Christians. They ended up slaughtering approximately 1 million of them. Many of those that survived fled, and many of them came here to Jerusalem to seek refuge. And many of their descendants live here to this very day. And this is the Christian quarter. This quarter is home to some of the most important Christian sites anywhere. In fact, no other place in the world would you find so many different Christian denominations represented in so small an area. And this here is the Muslim quarter, the largest quarter in the old city of Jerusalem. The Muslim quarter wasn't always the exclusive domain of Muslims. In fact, until recently, the quarter was a mixed Muslim and Jewish quarter. It was only during the anti-Semitic riots of the 1920s and 30s that the Jews of this neighborhood were forced to flee to the new city. And finally, we have the Jewish quarter. This is perhaps the most modern looking of all the quarters. The reason being, after the War of 48, when the Jewish quarter was occupied by the Jordanians, they systematically and maliciously destroyed most of the remaining Jewish homes, schools, and synagogues. Those lay in ruins until the Jews returned in 1967 to rebuild their city's broken heart. These are the ruins of one of the most prominent synagogues in all of Jerusalem. It was called the Chorva Synagogue. It was actually destroyed by the Jordanians in the 48 war. When we came back, we immediately started to rebuild the synagogue to its former glory. But there was only one problem. We didn't know what kind of synagogue to make it. We couldn't agree how big it should be, how small it should be. And so instead, what we did is we built this archway right here as a memorial. And that's pretty much all that's been there for the last 30 or so years. There's another interesting synagogue they want to take a look at. It's actually right below us. About 700 years ago, one of the foremost Torah commentators came to Jerusalem with a mission. He was known as the Ramban, and he came to help rebuild the Jewish community that was all but wiped out by the Muslims and the Crusaders. This here is his shul. Central to the Ramban's plan was to rebuild the spiritual strength of his people, and part of that plan included building this shul.
In the famous letter that the Ramban wrote to his son, describing his arrival in Jerusalem, the Ramban said that he chose a building that had 2 magnificent columns and had a roof, a dome upon it, and that became his synagogue. The Ramban synagogue has undergone many, many changes. What is today the Ramban synagogue is located on the place where the Ramban synagogue was, but it's not the exact architectural building that stood at that time. However, as a remembrance to it, the 2 columns that the Ramban mentions are inside the synagogue structure. They form the support of the structure, and they're the outstanding landmark of the synagogue itself.
And this synagogue is still very, very, very much in use today, over 700 years later, both by the locals as well as by tourists.
You will notice that in the synagogue there are two arks, two cabinets that hold the Holy Scriptures, that hold the Torah. Well, why do you need two? A good question. There are many, many different theories regarding this matter. But since it's a matter that is only seen in Sephardic synagogues in the Mediterranean basin, in synagogues that were, so to speak, under Muslim control, the accepted theory is because the Muslims and many times forced the Jews to place a copy of the Quran in the cabinet in the ark that held the Holy Scripture, so that the Jews would acknowledge, so to speak, that the Quran was just as holy as the Torah. There's another theory that in one ark, the books of the prophets, and also the book of Esther and the book of Lamentations were stored there, and the books of the Torah were stored in the other ark. But it seems that the origin of it was because of coercion by the Muslims, and therefore that's how the Jews accommodated their masters.
So there's a law in Jerusalem that says anytime you want to build up, just as well that law exists. Because when they wanted to build the Yeshivot HaKotel, you'll never believe what they found. It was a subterranean gold mine. What they found were the remains of homes that belonged to Kohanim, Jewish priests who lived here in Jerusalem within a short distance from the temple where they worked each day. These ancient homes were uncovered only 24 years ago from the slumber they've enjoyed for close to 2,200 years. Among the ruins of these magnificent homes, they found ancient seals written in ancient Hebrew. And so too were vessels used for cooking, Ionic, Doric, and Corinthian columns, small perfume bottles, sundials, and beautiful tiny utensils made of animal bone. When Israel was attacked by the 5 Arab armies in 1948, among the fighting there was the most tragic and the most intense was right here in the Jewish quarter of the Old City. This square was the place where all the surviving Jewish residents of the Old City were gathered by the Jordanians. And a few hours later, all of the women and children were driven from the Old City, and the men were taken captive. As the Jews were leaving their ancestral homes, one can imagine that most of them probably felt the same depression that their exiled forefathers felt when they left Jerusalem in Babylonian chains 2,500 years prior. So the question is, how is it that the Jews in recent and ancient history have been able to face endless challenges with fearless optimism? That despite all the challenges, we've never given up our dreams of coming home. Rabbi Wein?
I think that any objective observer of history has to stand back in awe to see that Jerusalem is again a Jewish city. How did this happen? And the only answer that Jews have for it is that this is the beginning of the fulfillment of the prophecies of our great prophets, of the Torah itself, that there would come a time that the exile would begin to end, that Jews would return home, that Jerusalem would again be the center of Jewish life, that people would realize that the Lord's guiding hand in history is upon us, and that therefore Jerusalem, I think, in our time takes on even a greater significance than perhaps at any other time, because it is the vindication of Jewish history and it is the harbinger of the Jewish future.
So it was right here 2,000 years ago, as the Jews were being led away in Babylonian chains, that the prophet Zechariah wrote this prophecy. It says, "So said God, once again, elderly men and women with canes will dwell in the paths of Jerusalem. So too will the streets be filled with the playing of children." And here we are, despite the Romans, Babylonians, the Crusades, the Holocaust, and back-breaking odds, back in our homeland. Another Jewish prophecy fulfilled. I guess you can say this is the magic of our birthright. When I was a kid, I remember that everyone was fascinated by new things, new cars, new houses, new buildings, new news. The newer the better. But now I'm finding that people are a lot more interested in history, in the old stuff, in the ancient.
It has often been said that those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it again. History is our lifeline. History is our rear-view mirror. History tells us where we have been and hopefully gives us some idea of where we're going.
And it's in that spirit, the spirit of discovery, that we take you back in time. Let's go. We're going to be in and around the old city of Jerusalem, taking a look at the ancient and the modern, the then and the now. We're going to be taking you underground and back in time and showing you a side of the Western Wall that I'm sure you've never seen before. But first, let's check in with Rabbi Wein, who's got some recent history.
Instead of this beautiful, spacious plaza that we see today, we have to conjure up in our mind a narrow alleyway, which was all that existed here before 1967. In this narrow alleyway, which was maybe 2 or 3 meters wide, the Arabs dumped garbage. They brought animals there. Under Jordanian rule, the Jews were not allowed even to come to that area, even though in the armistice agreements between Israel and Jordan, access to the holy places was supposed to be guaranteed. It became the dumping ground, and Arabs built their homes tightly to the temple wall itself, in fact, using the Western Wall as the back wall of their homes. This area was cleared out immediately after the Six-Day War to provide the Plaza of Prayer, which exists today at the Kotel Maravi.
Their first task was to prepare the holy site for the hundreds of thousands of tourists that would be coming here every single year, Jew and non-Jew alike. Now, what's really special about this time was, for the first time, Jewish archaeologists could come in, they could enter the area and see what secrets the Western Wall had been hiding for centuries. And before we check out those secrets, it might be a good idea for us to get a bit of a glimpse, a taste, as to what makes this the holiest spot on the Jewish map. Rabbi Wein?
Jerusalem was the main area of worship of the Jewish people. There they came to bring their sacrifices on the holidays, as well as their own personal sacrifices at other times of the year. The temple ground itself was divided into 3 sections: a large courtyard on the outside, a building that was magnificent that held all of the holy relics, and finally the Holy of Holies, which was situated on the western side of that building. The Holy of Holies was entered by the high priest of Israel once a year on Yom Kippur.
If this spot has been hallowed because of its close proximity to the Holy of Holies, well then brace yourself, because we're about to get even closer. When the archaeologists started digging around here, one of the first places they looked was underground. You see, secret tunnels had been discovered adjacent to the Western Wall, and they were excited to explore them. And now we can explore them too, thanks to the Western Wall Heritage Foundation. Right, before we go in, let's get a little bit of a lay of the land. This is how we see the area today. This is the Dome of the Rock. It's a Muslim shrine that sits inside an area that's known as Haram Ash-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary. But this wasn't always here. In biblical times, this is how the area looked. This little hill here is Mount Moriah, Har Moriah, and this is the place the Torah tells us that Abraham brought his son Isaac to be sacrificed. There's something very special about this spot. This spot is known as the spiritual center of the universe, and that is why 3,000 years ago, when King Solomon could build the temple, he chose to build it right here, on the place that the Bible says that God chose for his name to dwell. King Solomon built the first temple. It stood for about 400 years until it was destroyed by the Babylonians. After about 70 years or so, Ezra came along and he started to rebuild the second temple. That stood for about 400 years until King Herod came along. Now let me tell you a little about King Herod. King Herod was a man who had an appetite for construction unlike anybody. I mean, King Herod made Donald Trump look like a used car salesman. King Herod built the magnificent fortress at Masada, as well as the incredible city of Caesarea. Now, when it came to the second temple, what Herod did is he made some renovations and restorations to the actual building. But his real achievement was he took the platform that the temple stood on and expanded it to twice the size that it originally was. And much of what we have left today is thanks to Herod's appetite for construction. About 2,000 years ago, the Romans came in, they destroyed the second temple. Not much of it is left today. And about 1,300 years ago, the Muslims came and they built their shrine right here on this spot. Okay, now let's go in and see what secrets the tunnels are keeping.
These tunnels are from Maccabean times, from the Hasmoneans. They were used for bringing water to the area, and they also were used as a means of traffic control so that people would not have to walk through the temple, something which was not allowed, to use the temple as a shortcut, but rather they would be able to walk around the temple grounds and be able to come to their destination without desecrating the holiness of the temple itself.
The Western Wall Heritage Foundation actually have an incredible model that puts the whole area into perspective. Take a look at this. This is the Western Wall as we know it. The Kotel, this is where people come to pray. But this is not the only Western Wall. There's a lot more of it. Take a look. This is where the Western Wall starts, and it runs all the way along here, past the Arab homes, and it goes all the way down to there, nearly half a kilometer away. Now the question is, the Western Wall of what? When you take a look, the Western Wall is really the western retaining wall of the temple. This is a model of the second temple that King Herod built, and this is how it looks in relation to the land today. And here you can see the temple in all of its glory, just as it stood way back when. Our first stop is at Wilson's Arch. As you can see, the arch was actually the foundation of this bridge that was used for easy access by people coming into the temple from the upper city of Jerusalem. So the question is, how does Wilson's Arch look today? Well, we're going to find out. And the way that we're going to do it is by tapping into some of the magical atmosphere that is here in the tunnels to create our own television magic and teleport ourselves from here to there now. From here to there now. I said television magic now. Ah, that's much better. All right, cool. Ah, and there it is, right there, Wilson's Arch. Still standing strong after 2,000 years. Right now, the area is being used as a place for people to come and pray at the Western Wall, but out of the sun. Let's go take a bit of a closer look, shall we? Okay, here we are. If you come take a look at this, you can actually see the arch really, really clearly. This is the arch that, of course, formed the foundation of the bridge that came from the city into the temple. And by way of orientation, right here is where the women were praying, where we were just a moment ago. And if you walk straight through there, then you'll find yourself in the outside section of the Kotel. I'll tell you, something else that's quite amazing about this arch is if you look at the stones, you'll notice that there's no cement or mortar holding them together. In other words, the entire arch, all the stones are free hanging. because it's just the way that they're cut, the way that they're placed, and the pressure that they apply on one another that keeps the arch erect, which is kind of scary when you think about it, that there's nothing holding it together. I know that this thing has lasted for about 2,000 years, but I think I want to leave. Back to the tunnels. Over the centuries, people have puzzled and marveled over the mysterious fact that the Western Wall has remained standing for thousands of years while pretty much everything else has been destroyed. And there's pretty much two answers for why that is. On a spiritual level, it says that the Shekhinah, or the divine presence, rests on the Western Wall, safeguarding it and keeping it in its pristine condition. On a more practical level, you could say that the Western Wall is just very, very well built. We are going right there to these enormous stones right now. Where are you? Oh, hi. Okay. This might give you an idea how well the Western Wall was built. Right here is one of the single largest stones used in any building on the planet, or so we believe. It starts here and runs all the way. It runs, the same stone, runs, all the way to about here, 12.5 meters long. Can you believe it? That's about 41 feet. It also goes about 3.5 meters deep and 3.5 meters high. That's 11.5 feet. This thing weighs about 500 metric tons. To give you an idea how heavy that is, some of the largest cranes that we use today in our construction can only lift something half this weight. So it makes you wonder, how did they get this and other stones like it into the Western Wall? We just don't know. And if you think that maybe this was a stone that was already here and they just cut around it, it doesn't work that way. If you look right underneath, you see many, many more layers of stones that were put into place, that were quarried and put into place right here. This is what you call a miracle of engineering.
The size of the stone is especially significant since it is almost 10 times the size of the largest stones that were used in the pyramids in Egypt. These stones were moved by ashlars, by wooden pulleys, by wheels, and by human sweat and also human casualties. How the engineering worked is still a mystery to us. Now, Herod, when he built it, did not use any cement or lime to hold the stones in place. It's the weight of these enormous stones, one upon another, which itself holds the entire structure together. The Temple Mount lies on a fault. All faults eventually have earthquakes. There were earthquakes here in Jerusalem. Major earthquake took place in the 13th century. That earthquake shattered the Dome of the Rock, the mosque that's on the Temple Mount. The dome fell in. It was rebuilt. What we see today is a product of the rebuilding. However, the Temple Mount itself remained fairly stable, and the Western Wall has remained stable, so that even though earthquakes occurred, the Western Wall as we see it is pretty much the way it looked at the time of Herod, except for the new stones that were added on top by the Arabs over the centuries.
Okay, we're back at the model. Now, at the time the Second Temple was standing, there were 4 main entrances to get into the temple. And the one that we're going to be taking a look at right now is this one over here. This is known as Warren's Gate. Part of what makes Warren's Gate so special is that this was the entrance to the temple that actually runs closest to what Jews consider to be the spiritual center of the world, the Kodesh Kodashim, also known as the Holy of Holies.
The Kodesh Kodashim in the time of Solomon had within it the Ark of the Law. It had the tablets of stone, it had the staff of Aaron, it had a jar of manna. All of the relics of holiness of the Jewish people were in the Holy of Holies. And it was mentioned before, that only the high priest entered it once a year on Yom Kippur. In the Second Temple, all of the relics were swallowed into the ground. They no longer existed. So then the performance of the service of the incense was upon the Even Shethiyah, the great rock that protruded and was the foundation for where the ark stood in the first temple.
As we probe deeper and deeper into the tunnels, we find ourselves entranced by another world, another time. Everywhere you look, another clue revealing the way they lived eons ago. You look up and you see a hole in the ceiling and you realize that you're standing in an old cistern, a water reservoir, and a bucket would be lowered through the hole to collect water. A little further and you come across another perfectly preserved Herodian street and a pair of pillars that date back to the Second Temple period. A little further back, you find yourself in a room from a building probably used in the Second Temple period that's filled with all sorts of ancient relics. Like these ballistic missiles or projectiles that were used by the Romans in attacks on the temple. You can even see where the wall is scorched from the attacks. In the corner is a mikveh or ritual bath, which tells us that this room was probably used by the Jewish Kohanic priests in their temple services. And in the center of the room, we find a Corinthian pillar, probably used in the Middle Ages. Right, and that pretty much covers the highlights of the Western Wall tunnels. But our journey is far from over. We've seen what happens at the Western Wall, but not many people know that there's actually a fascinating Southern Wall, and that's why we're going to go take a look at it right now. Let's go. After the Jews reclaimed Jerusalem in the Six-Day War, archaeologists were also itching to see what was lurking around the Southern Wall. Little did they know that they were about to stumble upon one of the largest archaeological earth-moving projects in Israel. Earlier, we caught up with the chief archaeologist responsible for the entire excavation, Meir Ben Dov.
The main work in this area was done during 12 years by a group of 400 volunteers and 250 paid workers.
Meir Ben Dov made extensive use of ancient Jewish texts like the Mishnah to guide him in his excavations.
Doing archaeology, it's not just digging in the earth. Of course, it will be another story in Mexico or other places where you have no sources. But here in this area, in the Middle East, and especially in Jerusalem, there are many sources. We have mainly the Mishnah and Josephus Flavius. For me, as a Jew, it's not necessary to find things in archaeology. It's written in our sources, and I believe that what people wrote, and we knew it because of archaeology now, that it was true, so it was enough. You don't need to discover or to do archaeology to prove that we were here and we did work in this area, and the temple was here inside, and outside there were streets and shops and houses.
Until recently, the entire excavated area that you can see behind me was completely covered up and buried in the sands of time. And now it's been unearthed and awaiting our discovery at the Ophel Archaeological Gardens. Let's go take a look.
Along the south side of the wall, archaeologists have unearthed the remnants of homes and of mikvaot, ritual immersion pools. As you can imagine, the Kohanim, the priests that worked in the temple, didn't want a long commute, and the homes are probably their homes. All of the Kohanim, before they could enter the temple, had to immerse themselves in the mikveh to purify themselves. All Jews, before they entered the temple, also immersed themselves in the mikveh as a sign of purification, as a sign of respect, as a sign of the holiness of the temple. Therefore, it is natural that so many mikvaot should be found so close to the temple wall.
In the Talmud that was written about 2,000 years ago, it tells us about trumpeters who would blow their horns on certain days and at certain places to tell us that Shabbat and the festivals were about to begin. Josephus, the ancient historian, tells us that that place was in fact right there on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. The trumpeter would blow his horn 3 different times. The first time was for all the farmers out in the field to let them know that they should stop their work. The second time was for all the businessmen to let them know that they should close up their stores. And the third time was for all the people at home to let them know to stop cooking, get their nice clothes ready, because the Holy Festival is about to begin. Now I want you to take a look at something fascinating over here. This stone was found buried under dozens of feet of rubble when they were excavating the area. And what's fascinating is there's a partially preserved inscription that's amazing. Take a look what it says. It says, Lebeit Hatakia Lahav. Like I said, it was partially preserved, and we'll get to what this might mean in a minute. But what this says is to the house, or to the place of the trumpeting. Now what's amazing about it is that this was found under the southwest corner. So you want to know, why is this down there instead of up there? Well, because in the Roman attack in the year 70, it's believed that this was pushed off the corner and it landed down here. To be fair, we should tell you that this isn't the original stone. The original stone is sitting in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, but this is an exact replica. The end of the quote, it says, Lebeit Hatakia Lahav. It believes that the Lahav, what that means is Lahavdil ben Kodesh Lachol, which is the famous line that Jews have been saying for thousands of years at the end of a festival or at the end of Shabbat, which means to separate between the holy and the mundane. And that further gives us proof that the trumpeter would in fact stand to separate between the weekday and the holy festival. In their excavations, the archaeologists uncovered this, the original street that people used to walk on over 2,000 years ago. Now what's incredible is that these stones have been perfectly preserved. These are the original stones that people used to walk on, and this street here, this was the main drag, the main boulevard, the main entrance and exit way that people used to come when they walked alongside the western side of the temple. These huge stones that we see here were actually once part of the western wall. They were hurled down by the Romans during their destruction of the temple, and you can actually see the damage that they caused smashing the Herodian walkway below. This main Herodian street runs alongside the entire western wall. It runs under the Kotel Plaza, under the Arab homes, all the way to here. As you can tell, we're back inside the tunnels, and we're about 488 meters away. That's about half a kilometer long, and this is the same Herodian stone that you saw right there at the southern wall excavation, and here it is, over 2,000 years old and perfectly preserved. Can you imagine how long the street was, how large the temple was? And this is where it ends, right here. Many believe because Herod died, and I guess the money stopped and they stopped the construction of this particular walkway. Okay, let's get back to the southern walls. And to give you an idea how deep underground all this was, well, until the excavations in 1970s, that structure there is pretty much where street level was, as you can tell from this photograph right here. Now, archaeologically speaking, that structure is actually quite significant. I don't know if you can tell what it is. I'll give you a clue. Something that starts over there, and on this side of the street, you see a pier with some columns cut into it. Got a bit of a picture what this might be? Maybe from a little bit further back. Yeah, can you see it yet? Okay, this is what it is. This is known as Robinson's Arch. It was a major entranceway into the Second Temple. If you look here, where those structures jut out, this was actually the base of the arch that connected all the way on the other side to a structure that housed stores and merchants. And as you can see, there was actually a large stairway that led up and over the arch right into the temple area. This magnificent arch was probably destroyed during the Roman siege.
Now, because of the fact that Jerusalem was the center of Jewish life, it was a great commercial center as well. No industry was allowed in Jerusalem. Anything that would create the pollution, etc., was forbidden. But there were many, many shops because you had this tremendous tourism. Hundreds of thousands, not millions of people came every year, and therefore you had rows and rows of shops that supplied goods for the people, and that also provided the necessary animals and oil and flour, etc., for the temple worship.
Jews would come into Jerusalem on the three pilgrimage festivals of Pesach, Sukkot, and Shavuos. They'd bring the animals for special sacrifices that would happen on those days, and they would come here to the temple. They would actually come into the temple up these stairs right here, and they'd enter through those gates over there. Now, if you notice, these steps are actually shaped in a kind of a strange way. There's two short ones and then a long one. And scholars offer three different suggestions why they might be shaped that way. First, since they were bringing animals for sacrifices, it seems that animals could easier ascend these irregularly spaced stairs than regular ones. Second, large crowds of people could exit the temple a lot more efficiently by walking diagonally down these stairs. And number three, rather than people running up into the temple or kind of trotting up in a mechanical sort of way, the fact that these stairs are irregularly placed kind of makes a person slow down. Think about where they're going. Think about the holy act they're about to perform, and it really makes the entire experience just that much more special. It's worth mentioning, though, that these right here are the old steps, the ancient steps that are over 2,000 years old. These are the original steps that people used to go up and down into the temple. And these right here, these are just modern restorations. One can literally get lost in the sea of history. Ancient stones calling your name, beckoning you to recall times gone by. As we explore deeper, one wonders, what are we supposed to glean from these new discoveries? Why is understanding our history so important? And what makes these particular unearthed treasures so significant?
Seeing is believing. When you see the stones of the temple, you know there was a temple. And when you see all of the archaeological finds, you realize that the Jewish people and their connection to the land of Israel goes back for more than 3,000 years. It also vindicates all of Jewish history. It makes our tradition come alive. It gives it a place. It gives it actuality. It's no longer a question simply of faith and belief. It's simply a question of opening our eyes, looking, and having the sense of vision that history can give us.
Well, you know, this is amazing. We've spent the whole day running around the old city of Jerusalem, looking at the thousands of years of Jewish history that's lying around here. But this is really what it's about. A young boy having his bar mitzvah at the ancient Western Wall. This isn't Jewish history. This is the Jewish now, alive and present in Israel today. When people think about Jerusalem, perhaps what they think about most are the ancient ruins, the ancient Western Wall, the old things. But what about Jerusalem's more recent history? What about today's history? Well, as you're about to see, today's history is just as vibrant and colorful as it's ever been. The Jewish presence in the land of Israel, and in Jerusalem in particular, goes back thousands and thousands of years. But what exactly happened between then and now? When were there Jews in Jerusalem, and when were there not? Rabbi Wein?
There were always Jews in Jerusalem, with only a few time lapses. During the time of the Byzantine Christians, the Jews were driven out of Jerusalem. When the Muslims took over, then Jews returned to Jerusalem. When the Crusaders came in the 11th and 12th centuries, there were very few Jews, if any, that lived in Jerusalem. When the Crusader kingdom collapsed and the Emperor Salah ad-Din was controlling the country, the Jews returned to Jerusalem. And from that time on, there always was a Jewish presence in Jerusalem. In the 16th century, when the exiles from Spain arrived in the land of Israel, the Jewish community in Jerusalem flourished and grew. In the 17th century, there still was a major Jewish community in Jerusalem proportionate to the general population of Jerusalem. But we're talking in terms of numbers, really in terms of hundreds or perhaps thousands, but certainly not in the numbers that we are accustomed to when we think of Jerusalem today.
By the mid-1800s, practically all the Jews that lived in Jerusalem were crammed inside there, the old city of Jerusalem. And the situation inside there was not very pretty. Due to poverty and rampant hunger, visitors that would visit the site would balk at the squalor. Jerusalem was desperately in need of a hero. And thankfully, its hero, or heroes, should I say, stepped forward. When Judah Turo, the noted Jewish philanthropist from Newport, Rhode Island, passed away, he left $60,000 in his will, a fortune at that time, for the betterment of the Jews of Jerusalem. Now, he left that money in the care of a man whom he had never met before, but whom he trusted implicitly. That man was Moses Montefiore. You see, Moses Montefiore had just returned from the Holy Land on a fact-finding mission, and he knew exactly how to spend that money. So for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, in 1860, a new Jewish neighborhood was brought into existence in Jerusalem. Its name, Mishkanot Sha'ananim, also known as Tranquil Dwellings. And this is it.
However, those pioneers that were the first settlers, so to speak, outside of Jerusalem, every night came back to sleep within the walls because of the Arab marauders and the dangers that were involved in living in an open space, prey to all sorts of violent people who would come and despoil them. It was not until later that the permanent settlers remained and began to build the other neighborhoods, which became the basis for a new Jerusalem.
Now, believe it or not, despite the awful living conditions inside the old city, the Jews were still really reluctant to come and move into this new neighborhood. So what Montefiore did was he offered the rentals at enormously subsidized values. And when that didn't work, when that didn't bring the Jews from the old city over there to right here, what he did was he offered them rent for free. A bargain is a bargain. And if free rental wasn't enough to entice people to move to the area, Moses Montefiore built this, a huge windmill, so that people can come and grind their own grain to make their own bread. Now, if you're wondering who Moses Montefiore was, well, all you need to do is just step inside the windmill, because they've got a cute little museum in there. Let's take a look. You know, walking through this museum, you get to get a glimpse of the exceptional life that Moses Montefiore lived, being knighted by the Queen and meeting sultans and building Jerusalem and Rachel's tomb. You also get a glimpse of the kind of person that he was. His emblem had Jerusalem, Jerusalem written in bold, and his motto was think and thank. Think and thank. Those are powerful words to live by. He was also a very religious man. Wherever he went, he would take his tefillin, his prayer boxes, he would take a Sefer Torah, a Bible, and he would always be praying and constantly involved with Jewish studies and Jewish learning. He also had his own coach, his own carriage that he would travel around the Middle East on, and he would have his own cook and his own utensils, so that wherever he went, he would have kosher food. This is an exceptional man. He really did exceptional work.
Sir Moses Montefiore was the hero of the Jewish people of the 19th century. He traveled to Damascus to try and free the Jews that were falsely imprisoned in the blood libel case. He traveled to Russia to have the Tsar remove his terrible decrees. He came to the land of Israel 7 times, in which time he hoped to build a new Jewish community here in the country. Montefiore was an observant Jew. Montefiore lived a century. In fact, his centennial celebration was celebrated by Jews throughout the world. Montefiore was the symbol of a loyal, intelligent Jew who put the Jewish people at the primacy of his options and who attempted to do whatever he could in his lifetime to help Jews and to further strengthen Jewish identity, Judaism, and the land of Israel.
And today, this beautiful neighborhood just outside the old city bears the name of its visionary creator. It's called Yemen Moshe, the right hand of Moshe, the right hand of Moses Montefiore. Okay, are you ready? Because it's now time for a time warp. This is the historic neighborhood of Mea Shearim. It houses one of the most exotic communities in all of Israel. The thousands of people who live here in Mea Shearim are almost all descended from the Jews who came to Israel from Eastern Europe around the turn of the 19th century. They dress in the same fashion as their ancestors, and they live according to the same ideals.
The name Mea Shearim literally means 100 gates, but the neighborhood doesn't have 100 gates. It's based on the verse in the Torah that the Lord blessed Yitzchak, our father, 100-fold because of the efforts and holiness that he put into the country. So Mea Shearim means 100-fold blessings, 100-fold of God's goodness to the Jewish people and to the land of Israel.
When people come to Mea Shearim, one of the first things they want to know about is, what about the men that walk around with the long side curls and the long coats and the funny hats? Well, more often than not, those are called Hasidic Jews.
In 18th century Eastern Europe, a man by the name of Rebbe Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, the man of the good names, founded the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement, observant in halacha, within the tradition of Torah, nevertheless differed in its emphasis on prayer, its emphasis on social equality, its emphasis on goodness, on joy, on spirit, on reviving the Jewish people. Hasidus spread like wildfire throughout Eastern Europe. The Hasidic movement was a mass movement of millions of people, and it was based upon allegiance to a Rebbe, to a holy man. There were many, many different sects within Hasidus, but the unifying force was this idea of holiness, of a spiritual life, of joy, of the service of God and the service of man.
Okay, so here's the real question that I'm sure you all want to know the answer to. What is the story with the way people dress here?
The Jewish people are loath to get rid of tradition, and they wear the traditional dress that their ancestors wore, whether it be the black kaftans or fur shtreimel of Poland, or whether it be the colorful robes of Mea Shearim, which was the Turkish dress of the 18th and 19th centuries. It's meant to show continuity, tradition, and also modesty of dress. Jewish dress is not monolithic, even in Mea Shearim. Every Hasidic sect has dress that is a nuance different than the dress of another Hasidic sect. And the same thing is true of the Sfaradim, who also have nuances in their dress depending upon their countries of origin. And therefore you'll see differences in whether what color stockings are worn, whether it's knickers, whether it's long pants, whether it's black dress or white dress, what's the dress for the Sabbath. It's like a team uniform, so to speak, that people wear in order to strengthen their self-identity.
On earlier visits to the neighborhood, I made friends with a local rabbi by the name of Yom Tov, who offered to show us around and give us some insights into this unique place.
If everybody's dressed the same way, it has an additional value, and that's that you're forced to look inside for your individuality. You can't just be, externally thinking, is it me? And everyone's wearing the same thing. So you have to look inside and say, who am I? And to create your identity and develop who you really are from within, not from without.
What makes it special to live in a neighborhood like Mea Shearim?
I live in the richest community in the world because there's a richness of the life. It's an amazing richness, and there's a wealth, and you know what the wealth is? Is being happy with what you have.
When you come into Mea Shearim, you'll find a lot of signs, just like this one, that say things like, please do not pass through our neighborhood in immodest clothes. And what they mean is, please don't pass through wearing, men and women wearing short skirts, wearing short pants, cut-off shirts and cut-off tops. Now the truth is, when a lot of people come to these neighborhoods, they get offended by these signs. They're thinking, who are you to impose on how I dress and how I look? I once heard an explanation that kind of helped put the whole idea into perspective. Let's say you would want to go inside a Chinese temple, and one of the things that you'd have to do is take off your shoes, because if you wore shoes inside the temple, you would almost be defiling the holy place. Well, to the people of Mea Shearim, their neighborhood is their temple. Their neighborhood is a very special place where they try and cultivate the morals and the laws and the standards that they want to try and live by, that they want to try and instill their children with. When one comes in wearing short skirts and short outfits, it kind of compromises the high moral standard that they try to live by. And so they ask respectfully, please, to watch what you wear when you come in. And when you do, it works really, really well. Let's go and see what else we can find.
The neighborhood of Nachlat Shiva today is a trendy one. There are restaurants, pubs, shops. It's a place their tourists come to. It's a lively place. It's a place for young people, a place for adventure. However, Nachlat Shiva is one of the oldest neighborhoods of Jerusalem, and it didn't always look this way. It was founded in 1869 by Yoel Moshe Solomon and Yosef Rivlin on a desolate piece of land that they were able to purchase from an Arab, and that they raised money for outside of Israel, especially in Eastern Europe. The founders, Solomon and Rivlin, obtained 5 partners for this adventure of theirs. And that's why it's called Nachlat Shiva. It was the 7 people together who made this neighborhood what it was. These 7 each took one strip of the land that was purchased, began to build their homes there, and that's how the neighborhood was founded and developed. They had to have their own water supply, which were reservoirs of rainwater. The shutters protected them at night from Arab marauders. All the buildings were locked, and the architecture was such that it was built like a fortress in order to prevent outside forces from coming and destroying them. Now, you don't see that in Nachlat Shiva today, even though it is all there. The building was built Turkish style, very high ceilings, ornate stonework, interesting, beautiful designs, wood stoves, none of the accoutrements of modern-day buildings. As the neighborhood began to develop, more and more Jews from the old city transferred their residence to the new neighborhood of Nachlat Shiva. Wherever there are Jews, there are synagogues. And as Jews moved from the old city into the new neighborhood of Nachlat Shiva, 3 main synagogues developed in the small alleyways of Nachlat Shiva. There was an Ashkenazic synagogue, which was called Nachlat Yaakov. Then a Sephardic synagogue, which was then called Ohel Yitzchak. And finally, a Mughrabi synagogue, a synagogue for Jews from northwestern Africa. Each synagogue retained its own ritual, its own design, and its own atmosphere. And the synagogues still today retain the ritual and the atmosphere. The neighborhood has been gentrified. The old lives comfortably with the new. And as all of Jerusalem, it is constantly growing, changing, expanding, but still retains the flavor and the atmosphere of the holy city and of the people who built it.
And here are a few more beautiful neighborhoods that are outside the old city walls. This is Nachlaot, which means area of inheritance. It's actually a collection of a number of small neighborhoods that were built from 1875 through to the turn of the 20th century. This neighborhood is called Ohel Moshe, and is predominantly populated by Sephardi Jews. It's right next to a building complex known as Maskeret Moshe, and that's mainly populated by Ashkenazi Jews. Like Yamin Moshe, these two neighborhoods were also named and built in honor of that great benefactor of Jerusalem, the British citizen Sir Moses Montefiore. This is the world-famous Machane Yehuda Shuk, or market. It's been around for over 100 years, and people love to come here because not only is it one of the best places to buy fruit, vegetable and produce because it's so fresh and so cheap, but also, but you're almost guaranteed a really exciting shopping experience. The atmosphere in the market is fantastic. You'll often find the vendors yelling out and selling their wares by saying things like, "It's going down, it's going down." You're almost guaranteed to find yourself a bargain. And if you're not in the mood to buy, you can always just stop off for a little taste. So if Jerusalem is a microcosm of all the Jews around the world of different shapes, sizes, color, traditions, not traditions, religious, not religious, and each group kind of sticking tenaciously to their own beliefs and customs, the question that I have for you, Rabbi Wein, is what kind of hopes do we have for Jewish unity with all the different groups coming at Judaism from completely different angles? Rabbi Wein?
Jewish unity is based on a number of principles that all of us share together. The divinity of Torah, our tradition, our history, our vision, our attempt to help each other, and our attempt to build a better world. That's what unites us. Everybody can do it in their own way. Everybody has their own style. And since the Jewish people were scattered for 2,000 years over the face of the earth, it is really understandable that there should be so many different groupings and sects. What is remarkable is that in spite of all of these different groupings and sects, we have come together to create a country, to build a society. What unifies us is far greater than what makes us different from one from another.
And this is another pretty neighborhood in Jerusalem. It's called Rehavia.
Rehavia is the central neighborhood here in Jerusalem. It is the place of the Prime Minister's residence and the President's residence. It's also the place of my residence. Rehavia was a German colony, so to speak, because German Jews came here in the 1930s and settled it. It had a great intellectual base, professors, poets, philosophers, but the neighborhood has become anglicized in our time as well, and almost every language in the world, French, Spanish, English, Hebrew, Arabic, can be heard here. And it is one of the most beautiful neighborhoods in Jerusalem, both in terms of its physical beauty and in terms of its architecture, and also in terms of the interesting people who live here.
Rabbi Wein, when Jews make Aliyah, when they move to Israel from other countries, what kind of impact does that have on Israel?
In my opinion, immigration from North America is essential for the growth of the state of Israel. The ideas of American Jews, their energy, their worldview, their ability to live in many, many different worlds and remain staunchly Jewish, all of that is necessary here. And also their talents, and I may add their wealth as well, will help build the state. But also it helps build the immigrant. It helps create a Jew that is very, very hard to find in the exile and living under a non-Jewish environment. And therefore, Aliyah is from America especially is necessary both for Israel and for American Jews. And now let us take a look at a few more landmarks and neighborhoods in Jerusalem.
And as we begin to wind up the show, we now look back at our journey through the Jerusalem of old and the Jerusalem of today.
I want to thank you all for coming along on this journey to Jerusalem and for watching this show. I want you to know that Jerusalem is the place that unites time and space, that unites all Jews, in fact, that unites all of humanity. It represents our best hopes for the future, for our children, for our grandchildren, for mankind generally. The great Rabbi Nachman of Breslov said that every step that I take in life, I'm going towards Jerusalem. Every Jew should feel that way. Wherever we are, whatever we're doing, wherever we're going towards Jerusalem. The old Jerusalem, today's Jerusalem, the great Jerusalem that will yet be, that represents the finest of the Jewish people, of Judaism, and of humanity generally. So again, I thank you for coming along. I hope that you'll realize your dreams here in Jerusalem as I've attempted to realize mine, and that the better world that Jerusalem represents will soon come into being, and we'll all be able to experience it together.
And that brings to a close this leg of Rabbi Wein's Israel journey. Now we're going to be leaving Jerusalem, and we're going to be checking out the rest of this fascinating country, and we hope that you're going to join us. Until next time, bye.